Every morning, before you even realize it, you make dozens of decisions your ancestors could never have imagined. You wake up to the sound of an alarm, turn on the light before sunrise, grab your phone while still in bed, choose from hundreds of available foods, and spend hours sitting in front of a screen. All of this seems perfectly normal. After all, that's how the world works, but there's an almost invisible detail in this routine. While civilization has advanced at an impressive speed in recent centuries, the body that inhabits this modern world has barely kept pace with this transformation. Imagine, for a moment, that a human being who lived 50,000 years ago could walk through a modern supermarket. Endless aisles filled with sweets, sodas, snacks, bread, desserts, and ready-made meals. Elevators replacing stairs. Cars eliminating walking. Apps delivering food to your doorstep. Artificial lights turning night into day. For that hunter-gatherer, all of this would seem like paradise. But would it be? The great irony is that many of the characteristics that ensured our survival for millions of years may now be working against us. The intense craving for high-calorie foods. The ease with which energy is stored as fat. The tendency to conserve physical effort whenever possible. The constant search for comfort and security. None of this arose by chance. On the contrary, each of these characteristics was carefully shaped by natural selection on a planet where food was uncertain, the cold was constant, predators were everywhere, and surviving until the next day was already a huge victory. For almost all of human history, the greatest challenge was obtaining enough energy to stay alive. Today, for the first time, the challenge may be exactly the opposite. We live surrounded by food abundance, but we face record levels of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and other chronic lifestyle-related problems. We have never had so much access to technology, comfort, and information. Yet, we live with constant fatigue, poor sleep quality, anxiety, sedentary lifestyles, and a persistent feeling that something seems out of place. Is this just a coincidence? Or is our body still following instructions written for a world that ceased to exist long ago? This is one of the most fascinating questions in modern evolutionary biology. Researchers from different fields have spent decades trying to understand why such an extraordinarily efficient body seems to suffer so much in environments that, theoretically, should make our lives easier. Gradually, an idea began to gain traction. Perhaps the problem lies not in the human body itself, but in the enormous distance between the environment for which it evolved and the environment in which we currently live. This doesn't mean we are programmed to get sick, nor that it's possible to return to caveman life. Evolution is much more complex than that. Our organism is highly adaptable, but profound biological adaptations occur over thousands of generations. While agriculture emerged about 10,000 years ago, and the Industrial Revolution happened only a few centuries ago, an extremely short interval from an evolutionary point of view. Then comes the question that will guide this entire investigation. Do many modern problems exist because we still carry a body prepared to survive in prehistory, living on a planet that has changed too rapidly? To answer this question, we need to go back long before cities, agriculture, and even writing. We need to travel millions of years into the past, when every meal was uncertain, every walk could last dozens of kilometers, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. That's where the true story of the human body begins. Long before roads, supermarkets, or kitchens existed, there was only one challenge: survival. For about 99% of human history, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers. There weren't 3 meals a day, much less snacks available at any time. Food depended on the season, the climate, the ability to find fruits, roots, seeds, honey, or to capture animals. Some days were marked by abundance, others by absolute scarcity. This unpredictability wasn't a detail of life, it was the rule. Imagine waking up with no guarantee of food before nightfall. walking kilometers under the sun, following animal tracks, digging up roots, climbing trees, or facing competitors for a simple food source. Every calorie gained required time, effort, and often risk. It was in this environment that natural selection began to shape the human organism. Individuals who wasted energy unnecessarily had less chance of survival. Those who managed to store some of the energy consumed during periods of abundance were better prepared to face difficult times. Gradually, generation after generation, characteristics that favored this energy conservation became increasingly common. That's why feeling pleasure when eating energy-rich foods is not a defect of the human body. It's a survival strategy. Today, a piece of chocolate may seem like just a dessert. For a distant ancestor, finding something naturally rich in sugar, like ripe fruit or honey, represented a rare opportunity. The brain quickly learned to reward this behavior. Releasing substances associated with pleasure increased the likelihood that person would seek out that food again when given the opportunity. The same applies to fat. In addition to providing more than twice the energy per gram compared to carbohydrates and proteins, fatty foods were scarce in nature. When they appeared, consuming them made perfect sense from an evolutionary point of view. After all, that extra energy could mean days of survival if the next hunt failed. This mechanism continues to function exactly as before. The brain doesn't distinguish between a rare fruit found after hours of walking and a high-calorie milkshake bought in minutes. The reward system reacts primarily to energy value, taste, and sensory experience, not to the historical context in which these foods originated. But there's another, even more important aspect. Our species never evolved to live in constant rest. Contrary to what many imagine, the daily life of hunter-gatherers wasn't solely composed of large hunts. Much of their time was dedicated to walking, gathering food, making tools, transporting water, building shelters, and various other low to moderate intensity activities. Movement was part of life because it was inevitable. This doesn't mean our ancestors practiced physical exercise as we know it today. They simply lived. Physical activity wasn't a motivational choice. It was a natural consequence of the need to find resources. Interestingly, evolution also favored another characteristic: avoiding unnecessary effort. It may seem contradictory, but it isn't. Whenever it was possible to conserve energy without compromising survival, it represented an advantage. Resting after a long walk or avoiding useless movement preserved precious calories for truly important moments. In other words, feeling the need to rest after exertion is not a sign of weakness. It's also part of our evolutionary heritage. The problem arises when this tendency encounters an environment where virtually all physical exertion has disappeared. Today, elevators replace stairs, remote controls replace movement, apps eliminate travel, vehicles reduce walking, machines perform tasks that were previously entirely manual. For the first time in history, it's possible to spend an entire day expending very little physical energy without compromising access to food. From an evolutionary perspective, this situation is completely unprecedented. But perhaps the most profound change occurred about 12,000 years ago, with an event that would forever transform humanity's relationship with food: agriculture. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans consumed a huge diversity of plants, fruits, leaves, seeds, tubers, fish, and wild animals. The diet varied according to region, climate, and local availability. With the development of agriculture, some of this diversity began to decrease. Cereals such as wheat, rice, and corn began to occupy an increasingly larger space in the diets of different populations. For the first time, it was possible to produce large quantities of food in a single place. This innovation allowed for the emergence of cities, population growth, and the development of civilizations. It was an extraordinary milestone for humanity. At the same time, it initiated a process of food transformation that continues to this day. Centuries later came industrial mills. then large-scale refined sugar, highly processed vegetable oils, ultra-refined flours, soft drinks, fast food. Ultra-processed foods develop to be extremely tasty, cheap, durable, and convenient. Notice the speed of this change. For millions of years, our bodies evolved in an environment where calorie-dense foods were rare. In just a few generations, we have come to live surrounded by products formulated precisely to stimulate continuous consumption. From an evolutionary point of view, this interval is practically a blink of an eye. It is important to emphasize that this does not mean that there is a single ideal ancestral diet, or that all modern foods are harmful. Science shows that human populations have developed important adaptations to different dietary patterns throughout history. Some have even started consuming milk in adulthood. Others adapted better to starch-rich diets or extreme environments. Evolution never stopped, but it also doesn't keep pace with cultural and technological changes. While our habits change in a few decades, broad genetic adaptations often take thousands of years to consolidate in a population. And perhaps it is precisely in this mismatch that one of the greatest keys to understanding modern human health lies. Because if our body continues to respond like a survivor from prehistory, what happens when it encounters an environment where sugar, fat, salt, comfort, and stimuli are available 24 hours a day? This is exactly the question that science has begun to investigate more deeply in recent decades. And the answers reveal surprising mechanisms hidden within the brain itself. There is a scene that repeats itself millions of times every day. A person finishes dinner. They are physically nourished. The body has already received enough energy. Even so, when passing through the kitchen and seeing a piece of cake or a chocolate bar, they feel an almost irresistible urge to eat a little more. They know they don't need it, but they feel they want it. For a long time, this behavior was interpreted simply as a lack of discipline or excessive willpower. Today, science shows that the reality is much more complex. Our brains were not designed to easily resist high-calorie foods. They were shaped to seek them out. This difference completely changes how we understand human behavior. For almost all of our species' evolution, finding food rich in sugar or fat was a rare event. Ripe fruits appeared only at certain times of the year. Honey required facing swarms of bees. Animals with a large amount of fat were difficult to capture and varied according to the seasons. When these opportunities arose, it made sense to eat as much as possible. There was no guarantee of when the next one would appear. It is in this context that one of the most fascinating systems of the human organism comes into play: the reward system. Whenever we perform behaviors important for survival, such as eating, drinking water, or caring for children, certain regions of the brain release neurotransmitters that produce feelings of pleasure and motivation. Among them is dopamine, often called the pleasure molecule. Although its function is broader, it primarily participates in the processes of learning, expectation, and motivation. In other words, dopamine helps the brain register. That was important, it's worth repeating. This mechanism was extremely efficient for millions of years. The problem is that the environment has changed. Modern foods not only provide energy, many of them have been developed to intensely stimulate our senses. Precise combinations of sugar, fat, salt, texture, and aroma activate reward circuits much more intensely than most foods found in nature. This doesn't mean that these products are addictive in the same way as illicit drugs, as sometimes appears in simplified headlines. The comparison is much more complex and is still debated in the scientific literature. But there is an important consensus. Highly palatable foods can significantly increase the desire to continue eating, even when energy needs have already been met. That's why, often, opening a package seems much easier than closing it. It's not just about hunger. There is a fundamental difference between hunger and appetite. Hunger is a physiological need. It arises when the body needs energy. Appetite, on the other hand, can be triggered by emotions, smells, memories, advertisements, or simply the sight of food. You've probably experienced this. After a full lunch, someone offers a favorite dessert. Suddenly, a space appears that seemed not to exist a few seconds before. This phenomenon is known as food-specific satiety. The brain tends to lose interest in what has already been consumed, but remains highly responsive when a different flavor appears, especially if it is sweet or very palatable. Again, this made sense in nature. Consuming a wider variety of foods increased the chances of obtaining different nutrients. Today, however, this mechanism finds an environment where desserts, snacks, and sugary drinks are always within reach. But there is another invisible character in this story: hormones. For a long time, it was believed that body weight depended only on willpower. Eating less and expending more energy seemed like a simple equation. Today, we know that the body constantly works to maintain a much more sophisticated balance. Among the main regulators is leptin, a hormone produced by fat cells. Under normal conditions, it informs the brain that there is enough stored energy, helping to reduce appetite. There is also ghrelin, produced mainly in the stomach. Its levels usually increase before meals and decrease after eating, functioning as a biological hunger signal. These hormones constantly communicate with the brain, adjusting food intake and energy expenditure. However, this communication can be influenced by several factors of modern lifestyle. Insufficient sleep, for example. Several studies show that poor sleep is associated with increased ghrelin and reduced leptin, favoring a greater feeling of hunger and a preference for more energy-dense foods. It's not just an impression. After a bad night's sleep, many people actually crave sweets, pasta, and high-fat foods. Now imagine this scenario repeated for weeks, months, or years. The problem ceases to be just one meal, it becomes part of the routine. Stress also plays an important role. In threatening situations, the body releases hormones like cortisol, which help mobilize energy to face challenges. This mechanism was extremely useful when danger meant escaping a predator or surviving difficult periods. Today, however, many threats are psychological: deadlines, bills, traffic, work problems, excessive notifications, constant pressure. Although the type of threat has changed, much of the biological response remains similar. In some people, high and persistent levels of stress can increase the desire for highly palatable foods, although this response varies considerably between individuals. But perhaps the quietest transformation is happening elsewhere, in the environment. For almost all of human evolution, eating required intention. It was necessary to search, to hunt, to gather, to prepare. Today, you just have to walk a few meters, or not even that. A touch on a cell phone screen can put hundreds of food options at your doorstep in a few minutes. Advertising has also completely changed the landscape. Our brains evolved to pay attention to novelties and opportunities related to survival. Companies have learned over decades to use colors, sounds, aromas, packaging, and marketing strategies that capture exactly this attention. It's not a conspiracy. It's the functioning of the market encountering an organism that never evolved to handle such a large supply of stimuli. And it's not just food. Social media, short videos, games, constant notifications. Everything competes for the same brain systems linked to motivation, expectation, and reward. For the first time in history, the human brain lives surrounded by stimuli capable of continuously competing for its attention. This helps explain why so many people describe feeling constantly tired, distracted, or seeking some kind of immediate reward. But is this incompatibility between our organism and the modern environment just an interesting hypothesis? Or is there solid scientific evidence showing that this mismatch really influences health? In recent decades, researchers in genetics, evolutionary biology, physiology, chronobiology, and microbiology have begun to piece together a puzzle that seemed impossible to assemble. And the more these areas began to communicate with each other, the more surprising the answer became. For a long time, doctors and scientists analyzed obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, and other chronic problems almost always in isolation. Each specialty investigated only one part of the story. But in recent decades, an important change has occurred. Geneticists began to talk to anthropologists. Evolutionary biologists began to collaborate with endocrinologists. Researchers in sleep, microbiota, nutrition, and neuroscience have realized that many of these problems may share a common root: the enormous mismatch between an organism shaped over millions of years and an environment that has radically changed in an extremely short period. This concept has been given a name in evolutionary biology: evolutionary mismatch. The idea is relatively simple. A characteristic that was advantageous in a given environment may cease to be so useful or even become a problem when the environment changes much faster than evolution can keep up with. There are easy examples to visualize. Think of human skin. Melanin evolved as an adaptation to the intensity of solar radiation in different regions of the planet. When populations migrated rapidly to environments very different from those where their ancestors lived for thousands of years, new challenges arose related to both excess and lack of sun exposure. The same principle appears in various species in nature. Animals perfectly adapted to an environment may face enormous difficulties when that environment changes abruptly. With humans, many researchers believe something similar occurs with various aspects of modern lifestyles. But it's important to make a distinction. The evolutionary incompatibility hypothesis doesn't claim that there is a single, correct way to live, nor that we should try to exactly reproduce prehistoric life. That would be impossible. Our ancestors faced infections without antibiotics, high infant mortality, fatal accidents, and a much shorter life expectancy than today. Modern medicine, basic sanitation, vaccines, and technology have saved countless lives. Science doesn't propose abandoning these achievements. It simply asks, which biological characteristics continue to respond as if we were in a very different environment? One of the areas that has most strengthened this discussion is genetics. When the Human Genome Project was completed in the early 2000s, many imagined finding specific genes responsible for most modern diseases. Reality showed something much more interesting. Most of these conditions depend on the interaction between hundreds, sometimes thousands, of genetic variants and the environment in which a person lives. In other words, having a certain genetic predisposition does not mean that a disease will inevitably appear. Habits, diet, sleep, physical activity, stress, smoking, alcohol consumption, and various environmental factors profoundly influence how these genes are expressed. This is where another important concept comes in: epigenetics. Imagine that DNA is a huge library. Genes represent the books. But not all books need to be opened at the same time. Epigenetics studies precisely the mechanisms that help to turn on or turn off certain genes according to signals received from the environment. This does not alter the DNA sequence. What changes is how certain information is used by cells. Although this field is still rapidly evolving and many details remain under study, it reinforces an important message. Our daily habits influence much more than we imagined. Another protagonist of this investigation emerged in an unexpected place: inside the gut. For decades, it was believed that gut bacteria only participated in digestion. Today, we know that the microbiota performs much broader functions. Trillions of microorganisms coexist with us and participate in the production of some vitamins, aid in fiber digestion, interact with the immune system, and produce substances that can influence metabolism and even communication between the gut and brain. This doesn't mean there's a perfect microbiota. It varies enormously between individuals and populations. However, research shows that diets rich in minimally processed foods, fiber, fruits, vegetables, legumes, and different plant sources tend to favor greater microbial diversity, a characteristic often associated with good health indicators. In contrast, dietary patterns very low in fiber and high in ultra-processed foods can reduce this diversity in part of the population, although the effects depend on many individual factors. Another important discovery came from chronobiology, the science that studies biological rhythms. Our bodies have an extremely sophisticated internal clock. It regulates body temperature, hormone secretion, sleep, wakefulness, digestion, and countless metabolic processes. For millions of years, this clock was synchronized mainly by the natural alternation between light and darkness. Today, however, we spend a good part of our time under artificial lighting. We work at night. We sleep late. We receive intense light from screens precisely at the times when the brain expects darkness. Studies show that this disruption of circadian rhythms can affect sleep, glucose metabolism, appetite, and various other physiological processes, although the effects vary according to the intensity and duration of this exposure. Important discoveries about movement have also emerged. For a long time, it was believed that exercising for 1 hour a day was enough. Today, we know that remaining seated for very long periods can represent an independent risk factor for various health conditions, even among physically active people. This helps explain why small movements distributed throughout the day seem to play such an important role. Interestingly, this pattern is much more reminiscent of the behavior of ancient hunter-gatherers than the modern model of spending hours completely immobile and then concentrating all physical activity in a single gym session. But perhaps the greatest lesson brought by science is another. The human body is not our enemy. It is not trying to sabotage us. On the contrary, it continues to execute strategies that have been extraordinarily efficient throughout virtually the entire history of our species. When we feel pleasure from consuming energy-rich foods, when we prefer to conserve physical effort, or when our brain responds quickly to immediate rewards, we are not observing design flaws. We are observing ancestral adaptations functioning exactly as they were designed to function. The real challenge is that the current environment exploits these adaptations in ways never seen before. And it is precisely in everyday life, between supermarkets, apps, offices, advertisements, and screens, that this incompatibility becomes most evident. It is there that theory meets real life. Evolution did not prepare humans to make hundreds of food decisions every day. It prepared humans to seize opportunities when they arose. This difference seems small. In practice, it changes everything. Imagine a hunter-gatherer walking for hours in search of food. For much of the day, he simply found nothing to eat. When a tree laden with ripe fruit or a beehive full of honey finally appeared, his brain sent a clear message: take advantage while you can. In that environment, this strategy increased the chances of survival. Now compare this situation with the current routine. You pull into a gas station to fill up your car and find chocolates, sodas, chips, cookies, and sweets within easy reach. You go to the supermarket to buy just a few items and walk through entire aisles filled with products carefully arranged to catch your eye. You open a delivery app and, in a few seconds, you can choose from hundreds of meals, desserts, and snacks, available at any time of day or night. From a biological point of view, this constant availability is something completely new. The brain continues to interpret high-calorie foods as valuable opportunities, but now these opportunities never disappear. This creates an environment where the need for self-control is much greater than at any other time in human history. Another little noticed aspect is that a large part of our choices happen automatically. Research in behavioral psychology shows that many daily decisions are influenced by the environment around us. The position of food on the shelves, the size of portions, the shape of packaging, aromas, colors, and even ease of access can alter behavior without us realizing it. It's not because we are weak. It's because our brains use shortcuts to conserve mental energy. These shortcuts were extremely useful when decisions were simple and the environment changed little. Today, however, they are constantly stimulated by strategies developed to capture our attention. Just observe a supermarket. Fruits, vegetables, and legumes usually occupy specific areas, while impulse buy products often appear near the checkout counters. Colorful packaging is positioned at eye level. Promotions suggest urgency. Buy 3, last chance, limited edition. These techniques don't force anyone to buy, but they increase the likelihood of certain choices. They work because they directly engage with psychological and biological mechanisms that evolved long before the existence of marketing. The same happens with time. For most of human evolution, there were clear periods for activity and rest. Sunrise and sunset naturally organized the routine. Today, artificial lighting allows us to extend the day indefinitely. Cell phones, computers, and televisions keep our brains exposed to light and stimuli until late at night. This change may seem like just a detail, but it interferes with an extremely sensitive system: the biological clock. When we sleep less or at very irregular times, it's not just fatigue that increases. Studies show alterations in appetite regulation, insulin sensitivity, concentration capacity, and even how we perceive the taste of food. It's like trying to play an orchestra while each musician follows a different clock. The body continues to function, but loses some of its harmony. Another significant factor is chronic stress. Our ancestors faced intense dangers, but usually of short duration. A predator attack, a conflict between groups, or a storm required quick responses. After the threat passed, the body gradually returned to equilibrium. Today, many people live with pressures that don't end at the end of the day. Professional demands, financial difficulties, information overload, traffic, constant notifications, and the feeling of always being late keep the body in a state of alert for prolonged periods. This continuous activation can influence sleep, eating habits, mood, and the willingness to move. Instead of an immediate physical danger, we face an almost uninterrupted sequence of small stressors that accumulate over time. There is also an aspect that is often overlooked. Movement has ceased to be a natural part of the routine. Our ancestors did not exercise for health. They walked because they needed to find water, food, shelter, and contact with other members of the group. Energy expenditure was distributed throughout the day. Today, it is possible to spend hours sitting at work, then sitting in the car, and finally sitting in front of the television. Even those who frequent the gym can spend most of the rest of the day practically immobile. Therefore, many experts argue that it's not enough to just exercise regularly. It's also important to reduce excessive inactivity time, incorporating small movements into the routine whenever possible. But perhaps the biggest change of all is in speed. For millions of years, almost everything happened slowly. Meals required time to obtain and prepare. Messages were transmitted personally. Cultural changes took generations. Today, we expect instant answers for practically everything. Food arrives in minutes. Videos last seconds. Purchases happen with a click. This constant search for immediate gratification speaks directly to the brain's reward systems, which evolved to seize rare opportunities. The result is a feeling that there is always something new grabbing our attention, making it harder to stay focused and delay rewards. This doesn't mean that technology is an enemy. It has brought extraordinary benefits to health, communication, and quality of life. The challenge is learning to use it without allowing it to continually exploit biological vulnerabilities that made sense in another context. When we consider all these elements together, abundant food intake, sedentary lifestyle, irregular sleep, persistent stress, and excessive stimulation, it becomes easier to understand why so many people feel they are fighting against their own bodies. In reality, perhaps they are fighting against an environment that has changed faster than our biology has been able to keep up. And this perception has an important consequence. If the environment exerts so much influence on our choices, perhaps the solution is not to rely solely on willpower. Perhaps it is more intelligent to build an environment that works in favor of our organism and not against it. That is exactly what we will see next. After millions of years of evolution, a conclusion begins to become clear. The goal was never to conquer the body itself. The real challenge is to understand how it works. Many people spend years believing they lack discipline. They blame themselves for wanting to eat something sweet after a stressful day, for preferring to rest instead of exercising, or for finding it difficult to maintain a healthy routine. But in the light of evolutionary biology, these tendencies cease to seem like character flaws. They are reflections of mechanisms that helped our ancestors survive in an unpredictable and scarce environment. This doesn't mean we're condemned to repeat these behaviors. It simply means that fighting them requires more than willpower. It requires strategy. The good news is that small changes in the environment can facilitate healthier decisions, precisely because they work with how the brain evolved. One of the first steps is to make good choices easier than bad choices. It seems simple, but this idea is supported by an important principle of behavioral psychology. We tend to follow the path of least resistance. If fruits are already washed and visible on the table, the chance of consuming them increases. If ultra-processed foods are always in sight, open, or easily accessible, the opportunities for impulsive consumption also increase. In many cases, changing the environment is more effective than relying exclusively on self-control. The same reasoning applies to movement. Our bodies don't wait for the perfect time to exercise. They respond positively to frequent movement. Climbing stairs when possible, walking during phone calls, getting up regularly after long periods of sitting, or making short walks may seem like modest actions. However, when incorporated into routines, they help reduce downtime and bring our movement patterns closer to the one we evolved for. Frequent, distributed throughout the day, and integrated into daily activities. Another pillar is sleep. For decades, it was treated almost as a luxury. Today, we know that sleeping well influences the functioning of virtually all the body's systems. A relatively consistent schedule, a dark and quiet environment for sleeping, and reducing exposure to bright screen light in the hours leading up to sleep can promote better quality rest. These measures help keep circadian rhythms more aligned with the body's natural functioning. Nutrition also deserves a change in perspective. Instead of seeking miracle diets or perfect foods, many experts recommend observing the dietary pattern as a whole. Diets rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes, beans, whole grains, nuts, and other sources of fiber, combined with adequate amounts of protein and good quality fats, are consistently associated with better health outcomes in different populations. This doesn't mean completely eliminating ultra-processed foods, but recognizing that they should occupy less space in your routine. The focus shifts from prohibition to predominance. Another important aspect is learning to differentiate between hunger and the desire to eat. Not every desire to consume a food indicates a physiological need. Sometimes it arises from stress, boredom, habit, or simply exposure to the food. Taking a brief pause before eating, asking yourself if that desire stemmed from hunger or another trigger, can help develop greater awareness of your own behavior. It's not a foolproof rule, but it can be a useful tool for many people. It's also worth remembering that health doesn't depend on a single habit. For years, public debate has often sought a single culprit: sugar, fat, carbohydrates, gluten, oils, or any other component of the diet. Science shows a much more complex scenario. The risk of chronic diseases results from the interaction between genetics, diet, physical activity, sleep, stress, alcohol consumption, smoking, environmental factors, and access to healthcare. Reducing all this complexity to a single food rarely does justice to the evidence. There's another point worth highlighting. Each person responds differently. Age, culture, medical conditions, dietary preferences, work routine, and social context profoundly influence what is sustainable in the long term. There is no single formula that works for everyone. That's why extreme recommendations often fail. They ignore precisely the characteristic that has made our species so successful: the capacity for adaptation. Perhaps the greatest lesson of evolutionary biology is this: our bodies don't demand perfection. They respond to repetition. It's not a single meal that defines health, just as a single day of physical activity doesn't transform the body. What really matters is the set of choices made over weeks, months, and years. Small decisions, repeated consistently, have a much greater impact than radical changes that last only a few days. This completely changes how we view healthcare. Instead of asking, "How can I fight against my body?" perhaps the more intelligent question is, "How can I organize my life so that my body does what it was designed to do?" This shift in perspective concludes an investigation that began millions of years ago. But before concluding, we need to connect all the pieces of this story and answer the question that has accompanied every step of our journey. When we look back, we realize that the history of humanity is not just the history of tools, cities, or technology. It is, above all, the story of a body that learned to survive. For millions of years, every characteristic of the human organism was refined by an unpredictable environment. Hunger taught the body to conserve energy. Scarcity made the brain value calorie-rich foods. The need to walk daily transformed movement into a natural part of life. The alternation between day and night synchronized an extremely precise biological clock. These adaptations were not mistakes, they were true works of evolution. The paradox is that in a very short interval of our history, the scenario changed completely. We created cities illuminated 24 hours a day. We developed machines capable of performing almost all physical effort. We produced food on an unimaginable scale and built an environment where comfort ceased to be an exception and became the rule. The world changed. But the body continued to arrive at work every day with instructions written for another planet. Perhaps that's why so many people feel they are in conflict with their own bodies. In reality, this conflict may not exist. The body is not trying to sabotage you. It simply continues to respond in the way it has learned over millions of years. When we feel pleasure in eating something high in calories, when we prefer to rest after great effort, or when we seek quick rewards in moments of stress, we are observing mechanisms that, in another context, significantly increased our chances of survival. The problem is not the existence of these mechanisms, it is the environment in which they have come to operate. And this is perhaps the most important discovery of this entire investigation. Health does not depend on returning to prehistory, nor on following radical diets, nor on eliminating entire food groups. It's far less about seeking miraculous solutions. Science points to a more balanced path. The more we can bring certain aspects of our routine closer to what our bodies evolved for. Moving frequently, prioritizing minimally processed foods, protecting sleep, managing stress, and building an environment that favors good choices, the greater the health benefits tend to be over time. Not because we are cheating evolution, but because we are collaborating with it. In the end, perhaps the biggest change won't happen on the plate, at the gym, or with the clock. It happens in how we see our own bodies. Instead of treating it as an enemy, we begin to recognize it as an extraordinary companion, carrying millions of years of history in every cell, every hormone, and every automatic decision it makes to keep you alive. And that changes everything. The next time you feel hungry, lazy, or want to consume a high-calorie food, remember, these sensations didn't arise yesterday. They are echoes of an evolutionary journey that began long before the existence of civilization. Understanding this history doesn't eliminate the challenges of the modern world, but it gives us something far more powerful: the ability to make conscious choices. If this documentary offered a new perspective on how the human body works, tell us in the comments which discovery caught your attention the most. Your experience can enrich the conversation and help others better understand their own health. If you believe this knowledge could be useful for friends and family, share this video. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe to follow future documentaries, always based on the best scientific evidence and presented in a clear, responsible, and accessible way. In the next episode, we'll investigate another seemingly common habit that may hide surprising mechanisms of human biology. Until then, remember, knowing your own body is one of the most important steps in caring for it intelligently and consciously.